The county courthouse stood like an old sentinel at the center of town, its brick walls worn by decades of wind, rain, and footsteps of countless men and women who had passed through its doors in search of justice. On that morning, the air outside carried the faint chill of early spring, but inside, the atmosphere was heavy and warm with anticipation. The courtroom, with its polished wooden benches and echoing high ceiling, was filled almost to capacity. Neighbors, journalists, officials, and curious onlookers had come, each with their own interpretation of the case, and each with a hunger for resolution. At the far end of the room, elevated above the rest, the judge's bench commanded silent respect. Judge Eleanor Brooks, known throughout the county for her unyielding sense of fairness, had yet to enter, but the mere sight of her chair was enough to remind everyone of the gravity of the proceedings. The American flag hung behind it, still and solemn, a reminder that what happened here mattered, not just for those in the room, but for the larger ideals of justice that the nation claimed to uphold. Families of both sides sat separated, their eyes occasionally crossing like dueling currents in a restless sea. On the left side of the gallery sat a young mother, her hair neatly tied back, though strands had fallen loose in her rush to prepare that morning. Her arms cradled her toddler, a boy no older than 2, who squirmed restlessly in her lap. His small sneakers tapped lightly against the wooden bench, producing a soft rhythm that only she seemed to notice. She whispered reassurances into his ear, though it was clear the child was too fascinated by the vastness of the room to listen. The boy's innocent laughter occasionally bubbled up, breaking through the murmurs and coughs of the audience. Each time it did, a few heads turned, some with warmth, others with irritation. But the mother clung tightly to her child, knowing that though he was too young to understand why they were there, his presence anchored her in a moment that otherwise felt unbearable. Closer to the front, seated just behind the prosecution's table, a police officer rested with a firm grip on the leash of a German shepherd. The K-9 sat upright, still and disciplined, its dark eyes scanning the room with a sharpness that no human could match. To the untrained eye, the dog appeared calm, even indifferent, but its handler knew better. Every twitch of its ears, every subtle tilt of its nose, meant that the animal was processing the air, the people, the shifting energy of the courtroom. The dog had been part of the investigation, a detail many in the room understood, but few expected to matter inside these walls. Its presence today was meant to serve as quiet symbolism, a demonstration of the thoroughness of the authorities, a reassurance that nothing had been overlooked. Yet for some, especially those sitting on the defense side, the sight of the K-9 carried an unspoken weight, as though its very existence suggested a truth yet to be uncovered. The prosecution team shuffled papers at their table, whispering in low tones as they reviewed their opening arguments. Their faces bore the familiar mix of confidence and caution, the look of those who believed in the strength of their case, but understood how quickly a courtroom could strip certainty away. Across from them, the defense team sat equally composed, though their client betrayed hints of restlessness. The accused, a man in his early 40s, sat with his jaw tight, hands folded on the table as if the act of restraint alone could hold his world together. His eyes darted toward the gallery more than once, lingering on the faces that came to watch him. Some he recognized neighbors, old acquaintances, people who had known him in a different light. Others were strangers, yet their judgmental stares pierced just the same. The chatter in the courtroom ebbed and flowed like the tide. One moment the room buzzed with whispered speculation. The next it hushed at the sight of an official walking through the doors. Reporters clutched their notepads, prepared to capture each shift in the trial. For them, this case was not merely about guilt or innocence, but about the drama that unfolded in the search for both. High above the heads of those seated, the ceiling fans turned lazily, stirring the air, but doing little to ease the tension. The smell of polished wood and old paper filled the nostrils of those who had been sitting long enough to notice. A bailiff moved steadily up and down the aisles, his shoes clicking against the floor in steady rhythm, reminding everyone to remain respectful of the space. For the mother and her child, the courtroom was both intimidating and oddly fascinating. She had been there before, attending earlier hearings, but this day felt different. This was no routine appearance. The stakes had grown, the evidence had shifted, and rumors suggested that something unexpected might unfold. She tightened her grip on her son, whispering once more for him to stay still. The boy, however, seemed immune to the gravity of the room. His wide brown eyes scanned everything, the judge's bench, the attorney's papers, the gleaming badge on the bailiff's chest. And then, almost suddenly, his gaze locked onto the figure at the front, the dog. The German shepherd sat tall and steady, but to the toddler, it was not a trained law enforcement animal. It was simply a dog. A creature familiar and comforting, a living presence amid the sea of stern faces. His little hand twitched as if he wanted to reach out, and soon his tiny finger extended, pointing directly at the animal. A few nearby spectators noticed the gesture and chuckled quietly. To them, it was nothing more than an innocent distraction, a child's attempt to connect with the one figure in the room that seemed out of place. The mother, embarrassed, lowered her son's hand and whispered apologies, but the boy wriggled and persisted. The dog, perhaps sensing the attention, shifted slightly, its ears twitching as though it had heard something inaudible to everyone else. The handler leaned down, murmuring commands, keeping the animal steady. But in that fleeting moment, something stirred, something subtle, so faint that most dismissed it as coincidence. The toddler's giggle echoed once more, light and unburdened, and the courtroom, though not yet aware, was on the cusp of witnessing a shift that no attorney, no judge, no officer had prepared for. For now, however, the gathering continued as it always did. The bailiff preparing to announce the judge's arrival, the attorneys rehearsing their strategies, the accused clinging to fragments of hope, and the audience holding its collective breath. All the while, the smallest among them, a child who could not yet form full sentences, had already unknowingly set the wheels of revelation in motion. The courthouse clock struck 10, its chime echoing through the chamber. The sound pulled the room into sudden silence. The bailiff called for order, his voice firm and commanding, and the heavy wooden doors at the side of the bench opened at last. Judge Brooks stepped into the room, her robe flowing behind her, her face calm yet unreadable. Everyone rose to their feet, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. In the stillness, the mother shifted her son higher on her hip, and the boy, oblivious to the solemnity, kept his eyes fixed on the K-9. His small hand twitched again, ready to point. What began as just another hearing was about to become unforgettable. The courtroom had settled into a solemn rhythm. Judge Brooks adjusted her glasses, her sharp gaze sweeping over the crowded room, before she gave a brief nod for everyone to be seated. The shuffle of feet and creak of benches followed as the audience lowered themselves, filling the space once again with a murmur of anticipation. At the heart of it all lay a case that had divided the community for months. It was not the type of headline-grabbing scandal that would echo through the halls of Washington or New York, but in this small county, it had become the story everyone discussed at grocery stores, coffee shops, and church gatherings. It was a puzzle with missing pieces, a case that seemed straightforward at first, but had unraveled into a web of contradictions. The accused, Daniel Rees, sat at the defense table, his expression carefully guarded. He was a man who had once been trusted by many an electrician who had spent decades wiring homes and fixing outages across the county. Yet now he was painted as a criminal in the eyes of the state, accused of theft and obstruction of justice. The charges stemmed from a warehouse break-in where valuable equipment disappeared, leaving behind a trail of broken locks, scattered paperwork, and unanswered questions. At first, the evidence appeared to point squarely at him. His van had been seen near the warehouse on the night of the incident. A set of tools found at the scene matched the kind he used daily. And yet, as investigators dug deeper, inconsistencies began to appear. Witness statements conflicted. Timelines shifted. Even the surveillance footage, grainy and inconclusive, seemed to tell a story riddled with gaps. What made the case more perplexing was the lack of clear motive. Daniel had no debts, no known disputes, no history of criminal behavior. To many who knew him, the allegations felt out of character. Still, suspicion lingered, fueled by the nagging question, if not him, then who? The prosecution believed they had enough to convince a jury, but as the trial loomed, cracks in their narrative grew harder to ignore. Evidence that had once seemed definitive now carried shadows of doubt. And it was in those shadows that the defense began to build its strategy, urging the court to see Daniel not as a criminal, but as a man caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. The K-9, seated loyally beside its handler, had played a small but notable role in the early stages of the investigation. The dog had searched the warehouse in the aftermath, signaling areas of interest where traces of scent suggested someone had lingered. One of those spots had led investigators to the discarded tools now tied to Daniel. Yet even that connection was not airtight. Tools were common, scents could overlap, and the chain of custody for the evidence left room for questions. Judge Brooks tapped her gavel lightly, drawing the court's attention back to the front. We are here today to continue proceedings in the case of the state versus Daniel Reeves, she announced, her voice steady, deliberate. Both sides will have the opportunity to present further evidence and argument. Let us proceed with order. The prosecutor, a tall man with a commanding presence named Michael Turner, rose from his seat. He straightened his tie, glanced briefly at the jurors, and began. Ladies and gentlemen of the court, this case is about responsibility. The defendant had the means, the opportunity, and the presence at the scene. While he may appear as an ordinary working man, the evidence will show that appearances can be deceiving. We intend to prove beyond reasonable doubt that Mr. Reeves was not only aware of the crime, but actively participated in it. Turner's words hung in the air like a heavy curtain, drawing murmurs from the gallery. Some nodded in agreement, convinced of the state's position. Others sat with skeptical frowns, unconvinced by rhetoric alone. When Turner finished, the defense attorney, Margaret Lane, rose slowly. She was calm, measured, and her reputation in the county was one of quiet but formidable persistence. Her gaze swept across the room before she began. Members of the jury, she said, her tone steady but resolute, this case is not about assumptions. It is not about pointing to the nearest suspect when the truth proves inconvenient. My client, Daniel Reeves, is a man who has served this community honestly for decades. The prosecution will attempt to paint him as guilty, but the evidence, when examined without bias, will show otherwise. What we ask of you is simple. Look at the facts, not the assumptions. The truth is often more complicated than first believed. Her words, though less dramatic than Turner's, carried weight. People in the gallery shifted in their seats, considering. Daniel himself sat straighter, though his eyes remained fixed on the table in front of him, as if afraid to meet the gaze of those who judged him. The toddler in the gallery, however, remained blissfully unaware of the legal battle unfolding. He played quietly with the hem of his mother's sleeve, occasionally glancing around the courtroom with wide-eyed curiosity. When his gaze landed once more on the K-9, his tiny face lit up with fascination. His mother hushed him gently, unaware of how central that innocent focus would soon become. As testimony began, the courtroom sank deeper into the web of uncertainty. A warehouse manager testified about missing items, yet admitted under cross-examination that his inventory records were outdated. A neighbor swore she had seen Daniel's van, but under questioning, revealed she hadn't noted the exact time, leaving open the possibility that the sighting had occurred hours before the crime. The defense highlighted every inconsistency, every oversight, sowing seeds of doubt. The prosecution countered with reminders of circumstantial connections, weaving together fragments into what they claimed was a coherent whole. Yet the more each side argued, the clearer it became to those watching. The case was not airtight. It was fragile, balanced precariously on disputed details and uncertain testimony. Through it all, the K-9 sat quietly, a silent presence in the room. Its handler occasionally patted its side, keeping it calm. To most, it was little more than a prop, a reminder of law enforcement's diligence. But to one pair of small, curious eyes in the gallery, the dog was far more than that. It was alive, it was different, it was captivating. The day wore on, the weight of uncertainty pressing heavier with each passing hour. By the time the court recessed for lunch, the jurors looked weary, the attorneys looked restless, and the spectators buzzed with whispered speculation. No one could say for certain how the trial would end. Some believed Daniel was guilty, but clever enough to hide it. Others felt the state was grasping at straws, desperate to convict in the absence of a better suspect. Only one thing was clear. The truth remained hidden, waiting for an unexpected hand, or perhaps a small, insistent finger to bring it to light. The afternoon sun filtered faintly through the tall courtroom windows, casting pale strips of light across the wooden floor. Dust motes floated in the beams, drifting lazily, unnoticed by most in the room. The courtroom had grown heavier as the hours ticked by, weighed down by legal arguments, contradictions, and the constant tug-of-war between prosecution and defense. By now, the jurors looked tired, shifting in their seats as they tried to maintain focus. Lawyers leaned on their notes, the rhythm of testimony blending into a monotonous hum. Even the judge, though composed and dignified, allowed herself the occasional sip of water to stave off the weariness creeping into the chamber. But for one person small, restless, and completely detached from the solemnity of the proceedings, the heaviness of the room meant little. The toddler in the gallery, seated snugly on his mother's lap, fidgeted with increasing impatience. He had been remarkably patient that morning, distracted by the whispers and murmurs, the shuffle of bodies, and the occasional rise and fall of voices. Yet as the day stretched into its slower rhythm, his tolerance began to crumble. His mother tried her best. She whispered soothing words, offering him a soft toy she had tucked into her purse, rubbing his back in slow circles. But the boy was not interested in toys or lullabies. His wide eyes roamed the courtroom with an untamed curiosity, searching for something to break the monotony. That was when his gaze found the K-9 again. The German shepherd had been sitting at the front of the courtroom for hours, a picture of discipline. Its handler sat beside it, occasionally giving the leash a reassuring tug or whispering quiet commands to keep the animal calm. For most adults, the dog had become invisible, just another fixture in the courtroom, like the bailiff or the flag. But for the boy, it was different. To him, the animal was not a piece of law enforcement equipment or a symbol of authority. It was simply a dog, a living, breathing creature with fur, ears, and a steady gaze. Something familiar and far more exciting than legal jargon. The boy's little face lit up with recognition, and before his mother could stop him, his chubby arm shot forward, finger extended. He pointed straight at the K-9, his voice carrying a gleeful laugh that echoed against the high ceiling. A sound startled the quiet room. Heads turned, some smiling indulgently, others frowning at the interruption. The judge lifted her eyes briefly, though she did not scold. Toddlers were unpredictable, and she had learned long ago that sternness only drew more attention to the disruption. Instead, she allowed the moment to pass, tapping her pen against her notes, as if nothing had happened. The mother flushed crimson, pulling her son's hand down quickly. She whispered an apology to those around her, rocking him gently in an effort to quiet him. For a moment, it seemed the disruption had been contained. But the boy was not finished. He wriggled, determined to point again. His giggles bubbled up as he thrust his finger toward the front once more, louder this time, as if insisting everyone share his delight at the dog's presence. His eyes locked on the animal with unwavering focus, as though he and the K-9 shared a secret invisible to the rest of the courtroom. The dog, at first indifferent, shifted. Its ears twitched. Its head turned slightly in the child's direction, nose quivering faintly as it caught something in the air. The handler straightened, giving the leash a gentle tug, murmuring the dog's name. "Steady," he whispered. The animal obeyed, resuming its stoic posture. But its eyes flicked toward the boy again, acknowledging the small finger that pointed so insistently. A ripple of quiet laughter traveled through the gallery. Some found the boy's persistence endearing, a moment of innocence in an otherwise heavy day. Others whispered their irritation, muttering about distractions in a place meant for seriousness. The defense attorney paused mid-sentence, glancing briefly toward the source of the giggles before returning to her cross-examination. The mother pressed her son's hand down once more, whispering sternly now. "Sweetheart, quiet." Her cheeks burned as she tried to contain him, bouncing him gently on her knee. She could feel the weight of eyes on her, the silent judgment of those who believed children had no place in court. But she had no choice. Childcare was not an option, and her presence was required. The boy squirmed, resisting her restraint. He giggled again, his voice carrying a clarity that cut through the drone of legal arguments. This time, it was not just laughter, it was insistence. He babbled something unintelligible, the kind of half-words toddlers spoke when trying to communicate with a world that often didn't understand them. Whatever he meant, it was directed at the K-9, his small body leaning forward as though he wanted to crawl down the aisle and pet the animal. The K-9 responded again. Its ears perked. Its body stiffened slightly, posture no longer the relaxed stillness it had maintained for hours. The handler frowned, sensing the subtle shift. He whispered another command, firm but low, keeping the animal at heel. Still, he could not ignore the fact that the dog's focus had sharpened, not toward the boy himself, but toward something unseen, something the child seemed to have drawn attention to without realizing. For most in the room, it remained nothing more than an amusing distraction. A restless child pointing at a dog. Nothing unusual, nothing remarkable. Yet for those who had spent years around K-9 units, the subtle change in the animal's behavior was not so easily dismissed. The handler's brow furrowed, his hand tightening around the leash. Judge Brooks gave a quiet sigh, her patience worn thin by the interruption. "Let us proceed without distraction," she said evenly, her tone measured. The attorneys nodded, resuming their verbal sparring. But a few members of the jury, though trying to focus, stole glances at the front of the room where the dog had stirred. The mother kissed the top of her son's head, murmuring soothing words. "No more pointing, darling," she whispered. She now, the child, momentarily subdued, leaned against her chest, his giggles fading into soft coos. His finger, however, twitched again, a silent defiance, as his gaze never left the German shepherd. And though no one realized it yet, that small act, innocent, unthinking, and persistent, was the first tremor in the chain of events that would soon shake the courtroom to its core. For in the stillness that followed, the K-9 shifted once more, nose twitching, its body tense with a focus its handler could not fully explain. The child had seen only a dog, but the dog had sensed something else. Something that, in mere moments, would turn the courtroom's measured order into stunned disbelief. The courtroom, once settled into its slow rhythm of questions and objections, began to shift uneasily. At first, the disturbance was small, just a child's laughter and a finger pointed at a dog. But like the faint ripple that spreads across still water, the effect traveled outward, touching every corner of the chamber. The toddler's voice echoed longer than it should have, his laughter breaking the monotony that had wrapped itself around the trial. Some of the jurors smiled faintly, grateful for the momentary relief. Others frowned, their concentration broken, their focus dragged away from testimony. In the gallery, spectators leaned toward one another, whispering quietly, exchanging looks that blended amusement with curiosity. But the strangest change occurred at the front of the room. The German shepherd, once the model of stillness, shifted again. It was not dramatic, not the bark or lunge of a startled animal. Instead, it was a slow, deliberate adjustment of posture. Its nose lifted slightly, nostrils flaring as if testing the air. Its ears pricked forward, then swiveled to the side. To the trained eye of its handler, it was a signal, a subtle but unmistakable sign that the dog had caught something. The handler leaned down, whispering another command, his voice low and measured. "Stay. Focus." The leash tightened slightly in his hand. The dog obeyed, lowering its head back to position, but the stiffness remained. Its muscles tensed, as though preparing for movement, its gaze drawn away from where it had rested all morning. Few noticed. Most believed the animal's slight stir was coincidence, nothing more than restlessness after hours of stillness. But a handful of observers, those familiar with K-9 behavior, watched with narrowing eyes. One of them, a retired officer seated quietly near the back, leaned forward. He knew the look of a dog catching scent, the subtle quiver of instincts at work. The mother of the child tried desperately to quiet him, holding his little hand tightly, whispering promises of treats and toys if only he would sit still. But the boy wriggled, eyes locked on the dog, finger twitching with a stubborn insistence. It was as though he sensed the animal's stirrings, though in truth, all he saw was a creature that fascinated him. The court pressed on. The prosecutor called another witness, a technician who analyzed security footage from the warehouse. His voice droned as he explained how timestamps aligned or failed to align with statements given by witnesses. The jurors listened politely, though their attention wavered. The defense prepared its cross-examination, shuffling papers with quiet precision. And then it happened again. The child giggled and pointed, louder this time, his little voice bouncing off the walls. "Doggy," he cried, the single clear word escaping his mouth with delight. His mother's heart sank, her face flushing as she whispered frantic apologies. She bounced him gently, desperate to hush him, but her son resisted. The dog's head snapped to attention. Its nose twitched rapidly now, the subtle movements replaced by sharp, deliberate sniffs. It rose slightly onto its haunches, body angling toward the direction of the evidence table at the front of the room. The handler stiffened, both hands gripping the leash as he leaned close, murmuring firm commands. "Stay down." But the dog was alert now, gaze fixed, body tense. The gallery shifted uneasily. A wave of whispers rippled across the benches, some amused, others unsettled. A juror glanced nervously at another, raising an eyebrow as if to ask silently, "What's happening?" Even Judge Brooks, who had thus far ignored the child's distractions, lifted her eyes with curiosity. The prosecutor paused mid-question, following the gaze of half the room toward the dog. His brow furrowed as he glanced at the handler, who shook his head slightly, as if to say, "I've got this under control." The witness on the stand looked uncertain, his rehearsed answers forgotten, as he, too, stared toward the German shepherd. The mother, mortified, whispered desperately to her son, "Please, not now." But the boy laughed again, pointing insistently, as though declaring something only he could see. His tiny hand jabbed the air, not toward the witness, not toward the lawyers, but straight toward the animal that now seemed anything but calm. The handler tightened the leash, but the dog leaned forward, nose working furiously. It was no longer responding to the child. It was responding to something else entirely. The handler recognized it, though he kept his voice steady, his body calm. His dog had found a scent. The silence stretched. Even the bailiff had stopped his usual pacing, eyes narrowing on the animal, as though bracing for what might follow. The retired officer at the back crossed his arms, nodding slightly to himself. He had seen this before. He knew what was coming. The ripple spread further. Jurors exchanged uncertain looks. The defense attorney paused, sensing the shift in the room, her pen hovering over her notes. The accused himself glanced toward the dog, his jaw tightening. His fingers drummed nervously against the table, betraying the anxiety he tried to hide. The toddler clapped his hands with delight, giggling again, the sound carrying like a bell through the heavy air. And with that, the tension reached its breaking point. The German shepherd rose fully to its feet. The movement was smooth but undeniable, its body low and focused, muscles taut beneath its fur. Its nose turned sharply toward the evidence table, its leash pulling tight in the handler's grip. The handler stood quickly, commanding the dog to heel, but the animal ignored the distraction of the child now. Its instincts locked on something else, something hidden yet undeniable. A collective gasp swept through the courtroom. It was not the kind of shock born from sudden noise or spectacle, but the breathless realization that something had changed. Something unseen had shifted the trial, and it had begun not with lawyers or witnesses, but with the simple gesture of a child. Judge Brooks tapped her gavel sharply. "Order," she demanded, though her own eyes betrayed curiosity. The murmurs did not stop entirely. People leaned forward, craning their necks to see what the dog had found so compelling. The handler fought to keep the animal steady, his voice firm, commanding. But the German shepherd pulled against the leash, nose nearly dragging along the floor, as it angled closer to the table stacked with boxes of documents, photographs, and exhibits. The handler cursed under his breath. The mother, pale and shaken, clutched her son tightly. She whispered, "What's happening?" though no one had the answer. The ripple had become a wave. The trial, once locked in a battle of words, had been interrupted by something far more primal. The instincts of an animal that did not understand the law, but understood truth in its own way. And though the room would try to return to order, though the attorneys would scramble to regain control, no one could ignore what they had just witnessed. The smallest hand had pointed, and the courtroom could no longer look away. The German shepherd's sudden rise shattered the rhythm of the courtroom. For hours it had sat obediently, a silent emblem of discipline, but now its body was taut, its head low, nostrils flaring as if the very air carried a secret. The leash stretched tight in the handler's grip, straining toward the evidence table at the front of the room. "Control your animal," Judge Brooks ordered sharply, her voice echoing off the paneled walls. Her gavel struck once, a warning rather than a command. "Yes, Your Honor," the handler replied quickly. He tugged the leash, giving the command again, firmer this time. "Heel, sit," but the dog resisted. It obeyed only halfway, lowering its haunches but keeping its nose trained forward, muscles trembling with the effort of restraint. Its eyes locked on the table as though it saw something no human could. The gallery buzzed with whispers. Spectators leaned forward, some standing slightly to catch a better view. The jurors shifted in their seats, their composure fractured, unsure if they were supposed to watch the witness on the stand or the animal at the prosecution's table. The mother clutched her toddler tightly, her face pale with confusion. She had tried so hard to keep him quiet, unaware that his laughter and pointing had stirred something far greater than a courtroom nuisance. The boy, however, squealed again, clapping his hands. To him, this was entertainment, a game. To everyone else, it was a disruption on the verge of becoming something more. The handler crouched low, speaking to the dog in a tone both soothing and firm. "Stay with me? Easy, easy." He placed a hand on the animal's side, feeling the steady thrum of muscle beneath the fur. But the shepherd's nose twitched more urgently now, and it let out a low, restrained whine. The sound sliced through the room. Even those unfamiliar with K-9 behavior recognized it as something unusual. The retired officer in the back leaned forward in his seat, nodding knowingly. "He's found something," he muttered under his breath, though no one nearby dared to respond. The prosecutor cleared his throat, trying to redirect attention back to the witness. "Your Honor, if I may continue," but his words faltered as the dog pulled again, stronger this time. The leash jerked in the handler's grip, drawing gasps from the gallery. The shepherd lunged forward a few feet, paws scraping against the polished floor. Its nose pressed closer to the evidence table, dragging its handler toward the stack of boxes and envelopes piled neatly at its edge. The courtroom erupted in noise, spectators whispering, jurors exchanging alarmed glances, and even the defense attorney rising halfway from her seat, brows arched in intrigue. "Order!" Judge Brooks barked, slamming her gavel again. "Bailiff, assist the handler. I want that animal under control immediately." The bailiff strode forward, but even he hesitated as the K-9 pressed against the table, sniffing furiously at one particular box. The handler tightened his hold, sweat beading at his temple. "He's alerting, Your Honor," he said, his voice steady but tense. "Alerting to what?" the judge demanded. The handler swallowed. "I don't know yet, but he's trained. He doesn't false alert without cause." The room fell into a hush, the weight of those words settling over everyone. Trained K-9 South did not act on whim. If the dog was reacting, it meant something was there. The prosecutor's face drained of color. He stepped quickly toward the table, as if to shield the evidence. "Your Honor, this is irregular. The dog is not scheduled to be part of today's proceedings. This is an unnecessary distraction." The defense attorney cut in, her voice sharp. "Or it's a revelation. If the state's own K-9 has identified something, the court has a duty to know what it is." Murmurs rippled across the gallery again. Even the jurors straightened, their fatigue forgotten. They had come expecting a battle of words and documents, but now something tangible, undeniable, clawed at the edges of the trial. Judge Brooks leaned forward, her expression unreadable. "Handler, what is the dog signaling?" "He's detecting a scent in that box, Your Honor," the handler said. He tugged the leash once more, but the shepherd stood firm, pawing lightly at the cardboard as if to punctuate its determination. "Bring the box forward," the judge ordered. The prosecutor's protest rose again, but Brooks silenced him with a look. This court will not ignore what unfolds within its walls. "Bailiff, assist the handler. Bring the box." The bailiff hesitated only a second before moving to the table. He lifted the box carefully, placing it on a smaller stand before the bench. The K-9 immediately lunged closer, nose pressed against the cardboard, tail stiff, whine rising in pitch. The toddler giggled again, clapping with excitement, as if he alone understood the triumph of the moment. His mother buried her face in her hands, torn between mortification and dread. "Open it," Judge Brooks commanded. The prosecutor ran a hand down his face. "Your Honor, I must object." "Overruled," she snapped. "We are officers of the court, and truth remains the highest priority here." "Open it." The bailiff sliced the tape with a small utility knife. The courtroom leaned forward in collective breath, every eye fixed on the box. Inside lay a stack of files, papers bundled neatly together, along with a sealed envelope that had not been listed in the evidence catalog. The dog pressed harder, nose almost inside the container, whining urgently. The defense attorney stepped forward. "What is that envelope?" The prosecutor stammered, clearly caught off guard. It must have been included mistakenly. "Likely irrelevant. Likely?" Judge Brooks repeated sharply. She extended a hand, and the bailiff placed the envelope before her. With deliberate calm, she tore it open. Inside were photographs, grainy, but clear enough to show details that had never surfaced before. And along with them, a smaller item. A scrap of cloth, stained faintly, bagged but tucked carelessly among the files. Gasps filled the room. The handler nodded once, his dog sitting at last, mission accomplished. "That's it," he said quietly. That's what he smelled. The gallery erupted in whispers, the noise so loud the judge struck her gavel 3 times before silence returned. She set the envelope down, her expression grave. "This," she said, voice carrying across the chamber, "was not disclosed to this court. And yet here it is, in plain view." The prosecutor's face was ashen. The defense attorney's eyes gleamed with the fire of opportunity. The jurors whispered among themselves, their confusion mingling with intrigue. The toddler squealed with delight, oblivious to the storm he had helped set in motion. His tiny finger pointed again at the dog, as though insisting everyone recognize the hero at the center of it all. The K-9 sat calmly now, tail resting on the floor, gaze steady. Its job was done. But for the humans in the room, the real unraveling had only just begun. The silence that followed was unlike anything the courtroom had experienced that day. It wasn't the ordinary hush that came when a lawyer paused for effect or when the judge gave an instruction. This was different. It was thick, charged, the kind of silence that swelled with questions no one dared to voice yet. Judge Brooks held the envelope in her hand, her eyes scanning the photographs one by one. Each image, captured at awkward angles, revealed scenes inside the warehouse that had never been shown in court. A door ajar. A shadowed figure crouched near a stack of crates. Tire tracks stamped in dirt, the imprint too clear to dismiss. And then there was the cloth. Sealed in a thin plastic bag, it was small and ragged, but its faint stains told a story of their own. The K-9 sat calmly now, having fulfilled its purpose, but all eyes remained on the box and its unexpected contents. The defense attorney, Margaret Lane, rose slowly, her voice carefully measured. "Your Honor, I must ask the most obvious question. Why was this not disclosed during discovery?" The prosecutor, Michael Turner, shifted uncomfortably, his face pale. He leaned forward, gripping the edge of his table as though it could anchor him. Your Honor, I was not aware of those items. That envelope was not part of the prepared evidence file." The judge's gaze hardened. "Are you telling this court that material evidence was overlooked or concealed?" Turner shook his head quickly. "Not concealed, Your Honor. Overlooked, perhaps. A clerical error." "A clerical error?" Lane's voice sharpened, echoing in the chamber. She pointed toward the box. "That envelope contains photographs and physical evidence that directly contradicts the state's narrative. How could it possibly have been overlooked?" Murmurs surged through the gallery, louder this time, harder to suppress. Spectators leaned closer, whispering fiercely, while jurors exchanged bewildered looks. Some scribbled notes furiously, others simply stared in stunned silence. The accused, Daniel Reeves, sat frozen, his eyes wide, his hands gripping the edge of his seat. He had spent months insisting on his innocence, months watching his life unravel. And now here, suddenly, was something tangible, something that might prove he had not lied. Judge Brooks raised a hand, demanding silence. "Bailiff, approach," She handed the photographs and cloth to the bailiff, who delivered them to a court clerk for cataloging. Her tone was deliberate, sharp with authority. These materials will be examined properly, but one thing is already clear. They were not presented in prior proceedings. That is unacceptable. The handler, still crouched beside his dog, cleared his throat softly. Your Honor, if I may. The judge nodded for him to continue. My dog alerted specifically to that envelope. If there's cloth with biological traces, that's what he detected. It's his training. He's not signaling randomly. That scent, he gestured toward the bagged fabric, was enough to set him off. Lane seized the moment. Your Honor, the very fact that this animal had to discover it in the middle of trial proves negligence in the state's investigation. We must ask, what else has been missed? Turner bristled, his composure cracking. Objection counsel is speculating. These items have not yet been analyzed. They exist, Lane countered sharply. That alone is more than speculation. And they've been hidden, whether intentionally or not, until this very moment. The toddler in the us gallery squirmed happily, sensing the growing energy in the room. He clapped his hands again, his laughter ringing out like a bell amid the tension. To him, it was all entertainment voices rising, adults reacting, and his favorite figure, the dog, at the center of attention. His mother tried to quiet him, but this time, no one scolded her. No one even looked at her. Every eye was locked on the evidence. The jurors leaned in, straining to see the photographs that the clerk now displayed briefly before the bench. A few mouths dropped open. Others shook their heads, as though refusing to believe such critical information could have been withheld. Judge Brooks' gavel cracked against the bench. Order, she commanded, though her voice carried its own undercurrent of disbelief. She looked directly at Turner. This court will not tolerate mishandling of evidence. You will explain immediately how this envelope was omitted. Turner adjusted his tie, his words faltering. Your Honor, the warehouse files were extensive. It's possible this envelope was misplaced in the cataloging process. I assure you, there was no intention to. Lane interrupted, her voice like steel. And yet it contains photographs not previously seen and physical material that may point to an entirely different suspect. If my client's life is at stake, an oversight is no excuse. The audience erupted again, voices rising in disbelief, until the judge slammed her gavel twice more. The sharp sound reverberated like thunder, pulling the room back into tense silence. Judge Brooks exhaled slowly, her eyes narrowing. Very well. This court will recess until these items can be examined by both parties. We will not proceed further until their origin and significance are established. She paused, then added with emphasis. And should I determine that evidence was deliberately withheld, consequences will be severe. The bailiff gathered the materials, placing them in a secure case. The K-9, calm once more, lay at its handler's feet, tail curled neatly, as though unaware of the chaos it had just unleashed. But for the humans, there was no calm. Daniel Reeves sat straighter, a flicker of hope lighting his eyes for the first time in months. Lane leaned toward him, whispering assurances, her confidence renewed. Across the room, Turner rubbed his temples, knowing his credibility had been shaken, perhaps beyond repair. As the judge rose and exited, the spectators erupted in chatter, no longer restrained. Some speculated aloud about the photographs, others about the cloth. The retired officer in the back simply nodded, a grim satisfaction in his eyes. He had trusted the dog's instincts from the moment it stirred. And amid it all, the toddler laughed once more, clapping his tiny hands as though celebrating a secret victory. His mother held him tightly, finally realizing the truth. Her child's innocent pointing had led to something extraordinary. The discovery had come not from the lawyer's arguments or the witness's words, but from the instincts of an animal, and the persistence of a child too young to understand. What lay inside that envelope had shaken the foundation of the case. And as the gallery filed out into the corridors, voices buzzing with speculation, one thing was certain: the trial would never be the same again. The air in the courthouse corridors buzzed long after Judge Brooks called the recess. Conversations spilled into every corner. Lawyers huddled in heated whispers, reporters scribbling frantic notes, and spectators replaying the K-9's startling intervention like witnesses to a ghost story. Even the jurors, escorted out under strict instructions not to discuss the case, exchanged uneasy glances, their expressions betraying the impossible task of ignoring what they had just seen. Inside the defense's consultation room, Margaret Lane leaned over the photographs spread across the table. Each grainy image told a story the prosecution had never mentioned. Her client, Daniel Reeves, sat across from her, his hands trembling as he dared to believe that fate had shifted. "Look at this," Lane said, tapping one photograph with her pen. "That's not you. The figure's build is different, shorter, broader shoulders. And these tire tracks?" She spread two more images side by side. "They don't match the prosecution's timeline. If this was overlooked, everything else is suspect." Reeves swallowed hard, his throat tight. "Does this mean?" His voice faltered. "Does this mean they can't convict me?" Lane's eyes met his, sharp and steady. "It means they'll have to fight harder to justify keeping you here." "And with that cloth?" "If forensics confirm it holds DNA from someone else, then this entire case collapses." Across the hall, the prosecution's room was far less steady. Michael Turner paced like a man walking the edge of a cliff. His assistant shuffled through papers, trying to find some explanation for the envelope. "It doesn't make sense," Turner muttered. "We logged every piece of evidence. How could this slip through?" He stopped suddenly, pressing both palms against the wall. "The defense will tear us apart with this. The judge already suspects misconduct." His assistant hesitated. "Sir, do you think someone planted it?" Turner's head snapped up. The thought chilled him, but he dismissed it quickly. "No, that box came straight from storage. No one tampered with it." His voice, though, lacked conviction. When court resumed, the atmosphere was electric. The jurors filed back in, eyes darting, their restraint brittle. The gallery had grown. Word had spread, and curious townsfolk pressed in to witness the unfolding drama. The K-9 sat once more by its handler, calm, watchful, its earlier restlessness replaced by quiet vigilance. Judge Brooks entered with her usual authority, though her expression was tighter than before. She struck her gavel once. "This court is now back in session." The recess was necessary to examine the circumstances surrounding the newly uncovered evidence. Her eyes scanned both tables like a hawk. "I expect full cooperation from all parties moving forward." Margaret Lane rose first, her tone clipped but respectful. "Your Honor, the defense moves that these photographs and the cloth be admitted immediately for forensic testing and review by both parties. Their existence casts serious doubt on the integrity of the state's investigation." Turner stood quickly, his words tumbling over themselves. "Your Honor, while the state acknowledges the presence of these items, we caution the court against hasty assumptions. Their chain of custody is unclear. Their authenticity may be compromised." Lane's eyes flashed. "Compromised? They were in the state's own evidence box. Your dog alerted to them. If authenticity is in question, it's not because of my client. It's because your office mishandled the case." The gallery erupted again, hushed voices spilling into audible disbelief. Judge Brooks slammed her gavel. "Order! I will not wound this room again." She turned sharply back to Turner. "Mr. Turner, the defense is correct. These items were discovered in your custody. Their admissibility is not in question. Their analysis is." Turner clenched his jaw but nodded. "Understood, Your Honor." The judge leaned back in her chair, folding her hands. "We will pause proceedings until the forensic team can analyze the cloth. Photographs will be cataloged and examined for authenticity. This court will not risk injustice because of administrative failure." Daniel Reeves sat taller, the faintest smile twitching at his lips. For the first time, hope wasn't just an idea, it was visible, tangible, like a lifeline within reach. The K-9 shifted slightly, resting its head on its paws, but its presence loomed larger than any human testimony. To the jurors, it had become more than an animal. It was a symbol of truth, piercing through human error. As proceedings continued with procedural arguments, the tension only deepened. Lane spoke with quiet confidence, threading doubt into every mention of the prosecution's handling of evidence. "If one envelope was misplaced," she said coolly, "what else might have been overlooked? What else might contradict their story?" Turner fought back, his voice firm but fraying at the edges. "The state has no interest in suppressing evidence. Oversight, while regrettable, does not erase the overwhelming proof of Mr. Reeves' guilt." But his words rang hollow now. Each juror's face told the story. They weren't certain anymore. The photographs had carved cracks into the foundation of the state's case, and those cracks widened with every passing minute. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, their cameras flashing, their microphones catching every snippet of speculation. The headline was already writing itself. K-9 uncovers hidden evidence in courtroom twist. Back inside, Judge Brooks eventually adjourned for the day. Her parting words carried a weight that silenced the room. "This case has taken an unexpected turn. Until clarity is achieved, every claim and every piece of evidence will be scrutinized. Let this serve as a reminder. Justice is not a game, and truth cannot remain buried." As the gavel fell, the courtroom emptied into a sea of murmurs and speculation. Margaret Lane gathered her files with renewed vigor. She glanced down at Reeves, her voice low but resolute. "This changes everything. We're no longer defending, we're exposing." Reeves nodded, emotion thick in his throat. "I never thought anyone would believe me. But that dog, that child." He shook his head in disbelief. It's like fate wanted the truth to come out. In the gallery, the toddler clapped again, as if on cue, his laughter carrying above the fading noise. His mother held him close, her expression caught between pride and wonder. No one doubted it anymore. Justice had begun to turn, not because of arguments or strategies, but because of an unexpected alliance, a child's innocent gesture and a dog's unerring instinct. And with that turning point, the trial entered uncharted territory. The days following the discovery unfolded like chapters from a novel that no one had expected to read. Forensic teams worked with urgency, combing over the cloth, analyzing fibers, stains, and microscopic traces. The photographs were authenticated, their timestamps and film stock verified. Each revelation sent ripples through the courthouse, each report reshaping the case that had once seemed airtight. Inside the courtroom, the weight of truth pressed heavier with every session. Jurors, once passive listeners, now leaned forward eagerly, their skepticism sharpening into something more dangerous for the prosecution: doubt. Daniel Reeves sat at the defense table, his posture transformed. Gone was the hunched figure of a man, crushed by inevitability. In his place sat someone cautiously hopeful, a man who clung to each new detail like a lifeline. His attorney, Margaret Lane, had shifted her strategy entirely. No longer forced into defense, she now wielded the evidence like a sword, cutting through the state's arguments one by one. When the forensic report was read aloud, the courtroom drew in a collective breath. The cloth contained traces of blood, but the DNA did not match Reeves. Instead, it matched an individual already in the criminal database, someone with a history of violent offenses. The revelation landed like thunder. Lane stood, her voice calm but edged with steel. "Your Honor, this discovery not only discredits the prosecution's narrative, but points directly to an alternate suspect. My client has been imprisoned by assumption and error. The truth has been in the state's possession all along, ignored until a child and a K-9 revealed it in this very courtroom." The juror's eyes flickered to Reeves, then to Turner, then back again. The balance of the trial had shifted irreversibly. Turner tried to recover, but his arguments stumbled. He spoke of oversight, of coincidence, of the possibility that the evidence was unrelated. But his words carried no conviction. The jury wasn't listening to excuses anymore. They were watching a man struggle against the undeniable weight of truth. Judge Brooks, stern and deliberate, summarized the turning point in her measured tone. "This court cannot overlook the failures in the state's case. The newly admitted evidence presents a reasonable alternative explanation, one the jury must weigh carefully. Justice demands thoroughness, not haste." The gallery hummed with whispers. Reporters scribbled furiously, headlines practically writing themselves. DNA evidence exonerates Reeves. K-9 and Toddler spark courtroom revelation. Through it all, the toddler watched from his mother's lap, blissfully unaware of the storm he had stirred. His wide eyes followed the dog, who now rested quietly beside its handler, a living reminder of how instinct and innocence had changed the course of a man's life. When the child clapped, the dog's ears twitched, tail thumping softly, as though acknowledging his smallest supporter. The jury deliberated for less than a day. When they returned, the room fell silent once again, the kind of silence that carried history in its weight. "On the charge of armed robbery," the foreperson read, voice steady but heavy with the importance of the moment, "we find the defendant, Daniel Reeves." "Not guilty." A collective gasp swept through the gallery. Reeves' head dropped into his hands, shoulders shaking, the relief overwhelming. Lane placed a steady hand on his back, her face breaking into a rare smile. Turner sat rigid, his career unraveling in real time. The jurors looked solemn, their task completed, their expressions a mix of relief and regret. Judge Brooks nodded firmly, her gavel striking once. "A defendant is free to go." Court is adjourned. The room erupted some cheering, others murmuring, all of them aware they had just witnessed something extraordinary. Reeves stood, unsteady, tears brimming as he turned toward the gallery. His eyes locked on the child and his mother. For a brief moment, his lips formed words only they could see. "Thank you." The handler gave a quiet signal, and the K-9 rose gracefully to its feet. The dog shook once, as if shedding the weight of the trial, before padding calmly out of the courtroom. People stepped aside instinctively, their respect evident. To them, the animal was no longer just a tool of law enforcement. It was the reason the truth had been uncovered. Outside, the courthouse steps swarmed with reporters. Cameras flashed, microphones thrust forward, questions shouted above the din. Reeves stood in the sunlight for the first time as a free man, Lane at his side. His voice cracked but carried as he spoke. "I told the truth from the beginning. I owe my freedom to a lawyer who believed in me, to a child too young to understand, and to a dog who followed his instincts. Justice doesn't always come easy, but today it came." The toddler's mother carried him past the crowd, holding him close against the chaos. The little boy pointed once more at the dog as it passed, clapping his tiny hands in delight. His innocence had sparked a moment that no legal strategy ever could. Reporters caught the image: a laughing child, a steadfast dog, and a freed man, and it spread across headlines nationwide. The story became legend almost overnight. Justice found in innocence and instinct. Weeks later, the alternate suspect identified by the DNA was arrested. The evidence that nearly sent an innocent man to prison, instead, led to the capture of the true perpetrator. The irony was not lost on anyone. Justice had nearly faltered until a toddler and a K-9 redirected its path. For Judge Brooks, the case became a constant reminder of humility in the law. For Turner, it marked the end of his career. For Lane, it was the victory that defined her legacy. And for Daniel Reeves, it was freedom hard-won, fragile, but real. Yet perhaps the most enduring legacy was not in the courtroom records, but in the public memory. The image of a child pointing, a dog alerting, and a room gasping as truth forced its way into the open. Justice had not arrived through arguments alone. It had come through innocence and instinct, entwined in a moment no one could have scripted. And for everyone who had witnessed it, that moment would never be forgotten.